All right, guys, thanks so much. I know it's late in the day, but clearly you waited for the very best presentation. That's what I would have done. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how Universal Music Group is leveraging the cloud and Sony's C Media Cloud platform in order to achieve a whole bunch of cool stuff. So my name is David Rosen. I lead up our cloud application solutions for Sony Professional Services in America. And I'm responsible for our C Media Cloud platform, which is built entirely on top of AWS. So I'm really here for moral support in case there's any questions. Jared's going to be doing the bulk of the presentation, which I think you'll all very much appreciate.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everybody. So first and foremost, thank you very much to David and to Amazon AWS for hosting this. And as David said, we're probably going to make this fairly informal. So I think if there are questions throughout, there's no need to hold them. It's the end of the day, it's casual, we're sitting, it should just be a free-form discussion. So with that in mind, we'll probably jump right in. Can folks in the room just sort of gauge, give me a little bit of a gauge. Are there folks in the room who are somewhat familiar with the music half of our larger media and entertainment industry? Or is that maybe a bit newer, and do most of us kind of come from the audiovisual movies and television side? Are there any music folks in the room? There are a few. Okay. Few and mighty. So Universal Music Group, as folks might know, is the world's largest music distributor. And right now, UMG is in the process of sort of streamlining many of its workflows to really avail itself of cloud-based technologies, Sony C among them, so that we can really integrate the entire pipeline, the entire life cycle from our relationship with our artists all the way through to building really compelling, engaging experiences for the artist's fans. And so music actually works maybe a little bit differently than some of our traditional movies and television studios do. When everything at UMG, the heart of it is the relationship with the artist. And the artists who are represented by labels that UMG has worldwide. Many of these are sort of iconic labels that you might recognize. So whether that's the Capitol Records building up in Hollywood, or Abbey Road and the Beatles collection, or the Stones, those are all artists who are represented by various UMG labels worldwide. And as you can imagine, UMG has grown through the years by virtue of acquisitions and other distribution deals. And so that catalog is a very diverse catalog, and it goes back for more than a century. So the content in that catalog, both its audio recordings as well as its audio-visual works and its images, so those iconic photos of Frank Sinatra smoking a cigarette in his studio in Capitol Records building, right? All of that is very rich history that's familiar to all of us, and it's probably a part of many of our childhoods, and we have a connection to music that's a very unique and visceral kind of connection. That's what's in the library, and as you can imagine, like with most of us who own this kind of content, it's varied, it's diverse, it's decentralized, it's in various states of care, it's on various sorts of media, and so all of that will actually lead us to some interesting opportunities. So the way that UMG is structured is a little bit different than, again, some of our more traditional movie and television studios. So at UMG, we have what all of us might consider corporate groups, who in UMG vernacular, you might hear me reference these groups as center. We support all of our other groups, all of our other labels worldwide. And so those corporate groups, including operations and supply chain, traditional asset management, archive management teams, we work with and we work on behest of and in furtherance of the labels who are promoting the artists and who are creating these compelling, engaging, iconic experiences and are really invested in whether it's a Katy Perry, who clearly is a developed star, to discovering somebody who might be new on YouTube and nurturing that musician's career and seeing where that might go. Right, so all of that is encompassed again in all of these labels and in our archives. So UMG's mission is really oriented on creating those experiences. And one of the things that UMG recognized several years ago, very wisely so in my opinion, is that in today's day and age, as much as music is compelling, the counterpart of music, so music-oriented or music-centered video content, is also very engaging for the fans, and fans really want a lot of it. And they want everything from long-form full concerts to music videos to really snackable, digestible pieces of content that might be artist-generated, and it might just be, in getting to know the artist in a different way and working with the artist management in new and creative ways. So the types of content that we find in our library are actually very diverse, and as you can imagine, if we're talking about small snackable pieces of content, those pieces of content may not be shot with 4K cameras with large budgets, right? That's probably something that's shot a little bit more leanly, GoPro or something of that nature. So we have a very wide variety of audiovisual content in our library. And one of the other things that is a little bit unique to music is our timelines and the way that we bring content to market. We all experience it as consumers. It almost feels very last minute, right? When an artist drops an album as a surprise on a Tuesday, there's an enormous amount of buzz that goes with that. There's an enormous amount of engagement and excitement. That's obviously very different than all of us who know when Star Wars 27 or whatever we're up to now. We all know when that is going to be released in theaters, right? There are long lead times that are communicated to the public. Whereas oftentimes with music, that's not the case. And so what you actually have is a very large set of operations who are working without communicating this publicly in the same way that, again, a theatrical release would communicate its marketing timeline to the public, or would continue to release, trailer A and trailer B and teasers and teaser trailers and all sorts of other things. We work in a different set of timelines that are a bit more akin to sports or news or live events. And so that creates a demand for us to be able to segment and keep content confidential, even in some cases within certain parts of the organization, and have access to it in a very quick manner around the world, because oftentimes there's certain parts of the organization or the public who don't know when that content is going to be released, right? Those are very tightly guarded pieces of information of the organization, and so that speed with which we need to react is really critical for us in a way that is unique. And as a person who spent a couple of decades on the other side and with movie and television studios, I certainly feel the pressures.
You're not pointing at me, I'm not that old.
We might go back a year or two, you and I. But I certainly am experiencing those timelines very differently at UMG than we did on the studio side. And so,
I'm just going to make a quick comment about that. That's important not only operationally to understand, but it's very, very relevant to why cloud is an important component of plans going forward. So if you're just going to find out 2 days before that an album is going to drop, there's certain parts of the organization that have to react very, very quickly. So you can imagine not wanting to have an entire infrastructure set up for all the period leading up to that. You want to be able to scale it up quickly when you need it. Sorry for jumping in there, but it just occurred to me as I was looking at your fantastic slide that in addition to the communication challenges, there's true infrastructure and processing challenges that are associated with that decision to have very flexible timelines.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, and we'll see when we look at one of our use cases, because the manner in which sometimes this content is being captured is very diverse, and we actually have individuals creating it who in some cases may or may not be professionals themselves capturing it. So to be able to have that content centralized in a cloud-based platform that is accessible by the appropriate people in near real time is incredibly important to us. And again, because the types of content that we create are very diverse, and I know I keep coming back to that word. I do think it's very relevant for UMG's requirements right now. What you see here is we create what we all know as consumers as sort of the classic music videos, whether those are the official music videos or the lyric music videos or others. We have our recorded musical performances, so whether that's a performance at Coachella or a TV appearance. So for example, when a UMG artist appears on a late night show, right, that musical performance is something that we all want to watch the next day, right? We hear the buzz about it. Oftentimes we can't even wait till the next day. I'm usually the one, looking for it immediately online, saying, okay, I just heard, somebody just texted me, there was a great performance on, whatever late night show, and we all want to see that and consume it in real time. Clearly, artist interviews. We also actually have our own original programming. So UMG has a series of episodic series. They don't necessarily play out like a broadcast episodic, but they're branded series where we go through experiences with different artists as part of that branded experience. And so we release those as series, and they kind of function in the way that an episodic series would for us. We also have a lot of brand and sponsored events. That's a very prominent part of an artist's image, is the artist's affiliations with the brands who are iconic to that artist and that type of music. So that's an important part. And because music is a very timely, young, hip, it can also be, a little bit older, but there's an awful lot of it that speaks to how we promote new artists or how we engage new fans in that experience. It's engaging with our influencers who can say, hey, I saw this great new band play on this college campus, or I saw an established artist play in this great little small venue. Did you hear about it? Right? So those are all really important pieces of content for us that are managed in our libraries. And as mentioned earlier, it's just the nature of any organization like UMG, we're not alone in this, that again, by virtue of growth organically as well as through acquisition, we have our worldwide labels and our corporate groups at Center, based in Santa Monica, and we're supported oftentimes by different workflows, different tools, different vendor solutions, and at this point everybody in the room is probably doing a bobblehead saying, yes, that's the same at our organization. And obviously we have petabytes of content that are archived in different locations around the world. They're on diverse media. In some cases, it's the case of looking for the deck that can play that format of tape and, that just hadn't come out of the salt mines for a while or whatever it may be. And again, because of the nature of this immediate timing and the nature of the labels working together with Center to support our artists and our fans, there are very complex considerations for who can access content and when, and in what manner. So whether that is a watermarked piece of content, whether that's a low-res proxy piece of content, and you'll see that Sony C definitely helps us with that, whether they have the ability to download that piece of content or whether they can just preview that piece of content, whether we can give them limited access only for a window of time and then immediately revoke that access. Those are all incredibly important considerations for us, and what you'll see in the use cases is that thankfully there's a platform that makes that incredibly easy in 3 clicks of a button and access is revoked. And so with all of this content and with this enormous catalog and archive of very rich content, there are clearly also some opportunities to further augment the metadata about that content by maybe pursuing some AI or machine learning opportunities. And one of the first steps in any of those projects would be to have that content in a digital format readily accessible in a way that we could partner with Sony, with AWS to say, okay, is this a potential candidate for recognition or something of that nature? So that's a little bit of the reality of UMG's landscape today. When we were looking at options to support our reality and help us sort of migrate forward, we were really looking for a few key components. So we've talked about that centralized storage of our assets that would be accessible by this global community. where we would want to facilitate content discovery and the sharing, but again, for the correct users in the correct time. We would want to do that in a very user-friendly and intuitive manner because, as you've heard me reference, we have people accessing this content who may or may not be themselves professional, and people who are contributing content to this ecosystem of content who, again, may or may not be members of UMG, they may or may not be professional, and they may have varying degrees of experience with content management themselves. We also wanted to make sure that whatever options we brought into the ecosystem could play nicely in the sandbox, right? Where we could leverage those platforms to integrate, to have the symbiotic relationship with existing legacy systems at UMG, because I don't know that any organization is made of unlimited resources where we could just wipe out all of the history. I don't think we would want to anyway, right? So we wanted to make sure that it was flexible enough to be able to integrate itself with the appropriate systems at the appropriate time. Not all of that, can or should be done on day one either. And again, for us, it's managing it throughout that entire ecosystem, which at UMG is anchored very much in that artist relationship through commissioning a project. Project can be the album release, it can be the music video, it can be the brand-sponsored content, clearly through rights management, content production, metadata, which has a sweet spot for me, distribution, and then, of course, preservation and remastering. So when we reached out to the Sony team, there were a few key considerations for us, and we found an awful lot of synergy with Sony and the way that also Sony has incorporated AWS and the way that we have access to our assets. So one of the key considerations for us, first and foremost, is that this is very heavy content, as we know. It's not that easy to move video around, and so I guess on one hand, somebody could upload it to a cloud-based document management file sharing platform, but that's only going to work for a JPEG, right? That's not going to work for the assets that we all typically handle every day. So the fact that this was born in our industry and born to handle specifically these types of assets and their associated metadata was very beneficial for us. Again, the integration within the UMG ecosystem, the fact that because we do have such a large catalog of tremendously valuable archive content, the fact that there was a way for us to get large swaths, so terabytes of content at a time, if we choose, into the system was very appealing to us as well. The fact that we could leverage the snowball process, and the fact that we could control the access, revoke that access in a timely manner, and the fact that within the center groups, clearly there's an eye to cost containment, so that we can choose whether those assets need to be available in S3 or Glacier, so they need to be online or they can be archived with a minimal delay to restore those assets, was again very appealing to us from a financial perspective. With that, any questions or pause? Anything to add before we maybe jump into some specific examples?
No, other than, I may just say keep an eye out for this kind of parallel between cloud, centralized content in the cloud, right? We've heard a lot of the benefits that are just intrinsic in that concept. But in parallel with that is now this concept of having remote contributors or remote teams working all over the place. And those two clearly go very, very closely in step. And so just to kind of put a little bit of like one quick broad stroke of what C is doing with AWS, C is leveraging AWS, the strength, breadth, and power of what it can do, but putting on top of that an application and collaboration management platform that deals with professional formats to enable those remote teams to take advantage of the centralized aspects of the cloud. So as much as it is a technology shift that we're seeing with processing and storage moving into a centralized location, it's interesting because you're seeing sort of the antithesis of that with the actual work being done with that. Because rather than trying to bring everything into one location, we're trying to take advantage of the best talent wherever they happen to be, to eliminate a lot of transport and physical locality required historically. So it's kind of a neat thing to think about. As we're bringing all of the content together, we're enabling these teams externally to work remotely much better.
Okay, so we thought we might make this a little bit more tangible by taking a look at 3 different use cases with groups who are now leveraging Sony C and AWS at UMG. So the first one is actually our College and Lifestyle Marketing group. And again, this is a little bit unique. So this is a group who actually works with college reps on campuses throughout the United States and in the UK. And those college reps partner with UMG so that when we have UMG artists who are either performing on campus or they're performing at festivals, those college reps actually help us to engage with the fans, engage with the artists. Those college reps create and produce content with us. And so it's a very interesting dynamic because it's a different perspective on what is compelling content, how can it be created, what would be interesting to fans, what would be an interesting way to expose an artist to maybe a new demographic. And so these college reps are fantastic, and this is a group within UMG who's grown phenomenally in the recent past and continues to grow and expand geographically as well. And so by the nature of this dynamic, we have college reps, so students on campuses in the US and the UK, so again, that geographic dispersion that David just mentioned, who are creating this content. For us, that means that when we were looking at this workflow and assessing whether this workflow would be a potentially an interesting candidate workflow to leverage Sony C and AWS, we were very cognizant that that meant that our stakeholders were the creative team at Center, so at the home office at corporate in Santa Monica, who support these college reps. Clearly the artist teams, right? The artists are at the heart of everything that we do, and the reps who themselves need to be supported. And this might be their first foray into some of these types of activities. So we needed a solution that was going to be very intuitive, very user-friendly, with very little onboarding. We certainly couldn't be installing things on location. We couldn't be, pushing new patches every day or whatever we were doing, right? It had to be really nimble and just a very easy onboarding. And because they're college reps, as you can imagine, they also change, right? There's a high degree of turnover as college students go through their careers and they move on to other things. So again, it needed to be something that was really repeatable because these were not people who were going to be in the same position for 10 years. And what we've really found that for this group, the business benefits that have accrued are multiple. So enabling that partnership with the artists and their management teams is fantastic. So we can shoot this content in location, we can send it back to Center, the creative teams at Center, the executives can have those conversations with the artists and their management teams and determine which content is appropriate and message their campaigns appropriately. So that artist promotion is fantastic. The very rapid and cost-effective content production and distribution. So one of the things that, again, David had mentioned was by virtue of these disparate teams, there are many aspects of collaboration in the platform of which we avail ourselves, not the least of which right now is one that this group is just starting to use, which is in real time, these groups can actually be reviewing the content and taking time code-based notes, capturing it, and actually having collaborative and interactive sessions with each other, being in different locations. That is phenomenal that they can do that. It really accelerates those timelines, and again, in some cases, these might be smaller budgets. We're not talking about Star Wars, whatever we're up to now. We're talking about much more nimble things. These might be for breaking artists, and it's a very manageable way of enabling those operations. And again, making sure that all of that content is back here at Center, that there's visibility, and that immediately when that content is uploaded, not only is it available for the operational teams and the creative teams, but it's also immediately available to our archive and preservation teams so that they, based on their workflow, based on their business decisions, based on their business criteria, that they have immediate access to that content, and as appropriate, based on those business criteria, they can do what they need to do with it from an archive and preservation perspective so that we're not, I don't know, shipping hard drives that get lost, no disrespect to FedEx and UPS, but whatever happens to, you know, physical media or those kinds of things that might happen, right? So those are some really very tangible benefits that were realized very quickly. And these are some of the components of the platform that are built in that we were able to use to do that. So as you can imagine, some of these campuses or some of these locations, you know, bandwidth is variable. We're not talking about people sitting on a lot with, you know, gig connections everywhere, right? These are on-site folks who need to be able to upload these files, and because there is that file acceleration built into the platform, that goes a long way to facilitating that, and it certainly is very helpful when connection drops and the upload needs to automatically resume so that it can continue, so that editors can start working as soon as they start seeing that content hit that system. Again, as that content is hitting that system, we have our LA-based executives and the artist teams that have visibility to it, and they can start having their appropriate conversations. And then they need to obviously be sharing that content in a way that is secure and appropriate. So via a concept that in Sony C-Speak is called a media box, we can share that content out, and it's not sharing a copy of that content. It's sharing temporal access to that content. Like, we can determine for how long a person has access to that content, and if for some reason we've shared 2 pieces of content, we need to share 3, we immediately add a 3rd piece of content to it, and it's immediately visible to that individual. If there's a piece of content that for some reason needs to come down, we take it down, and that person or those people have lost access to that content, right? We control all of that. We can enable or not download. If it is a video and we've enabled streaming, we can even enable a watermark on it, right? So all of those things are very security-oriented features that are important to us, and because they're very easy to turn on and off, it gives the team here an awful lot of flexibility.
So real quick on this, JR. Obviously, given that these things happen so quickly, and you can imagine there's more than one college that you may be dealing with at any given point in time, so lots of teams spread out all over the country. You don't necessarily have an entire team supporting them. So getting things quickly from location to somebody else so they can see it without having to your point, ship it to another location, regardless of whether or not it's physical or even digital. Not having to move that content gives you an immediate advantage, which is ultimately going to reduce the amount of time required to turn these projects around very, very quickly so we can get on to the next project. And then there's also a security aspect associated with it, right? The fewer places you have that content sitting, the less attack vectors there are for it. That's obviously very, very important when it comes to some of this high-value content that's being created literally every day. So I just wanted to kind of point that as an additional advantage of time saving, enabling teams to work together much more quickly without having to ship content, and also the security kind of benefit that comes along with it.
I agree, and I think you made another excellent point, which is that we don't actually have an army of people supporting the deployment of this platform across all of these groups. We have 2 of us, so a gentleman in our organization, Alan Lee, and myself, who really assist our users on an as-needed basis. It is intuitive, so it's not as if we hired onshore, offshore team of help desk people to resolve these things. And so one of the other nice features when you're talking about those sort of security parameters that we have is because the mechanism for sharing that content, in this case media boxes, also has an expiration date. I can tell you that for me it's actually really lovely, because when I then look in and see the hundreds of media boxes that we have created to share thousands of pieces of content with the appropriate people worldwide, and those are just active media boxes as of this morning, right? We're constantly creating new ones. The fact that the person who's creating that media box can set an expiration date, and I know that that portal to that content will automatically close on that day, is a fantastic benefit, because, you know, as all of us are who are responsible for for the security of our IP, we want to make sure that those portals to our content aren't left open indefinitely. So we regularly take a look at that, and it's certainly very helpful to us. Again, one of the other things that's very helpful is the fact that when our content is ingested into the system, it might be more appropriate to interact with a lower res proxy or even a custom proxy if that would be more appropriate for a particular workflow. So the fact that those proxies are automatically being created on ingest, and it's not one of those processes that says, oh, okay, so I needed it in a different format, so now I have to cut a purchase order, and a vendor has to do a transcode and a thing, it's there. It's already in the system, and the users have access to that suite of proxies themselves directly in the UI is fantastic for us. We talked a bit about those review sessions where it enables that online real-time collaboration with timecode-based metadata so that you can make comments and say yes to this and no to that and lighten the other, and whoops, we have some text on screen here, or there's a brand or a logo, let's be careful of that, right? All of the things that we're very used to doing with our content. And the fact that we do have turnover because they're college reps, so we're always onboarding new reps, we're onboarding new campuses, we're expanding. It is important that because, as David mentioned, we don't have a large group of people supporting this, that the heads of these teams should themselves be able to onboard and offboard their team members really quickly. And so the process of adding new reps to these groups and giving them access to the content or revoking access from individuals when they graduate, the fact that that's a few clicks in the system and that it is always available and can be administered by the leaders of these teams is highly beneficial because it clearly reduces the number of late night calls that I would receive. So that's our college and lifestyle group, really interesting use case, and it's worked very well for them, and they have created hundreds of projects worth of content, and it's been very successful.
Jerry, if I can, on this slide real quick, it's worth pointing out some of the underlying technology that we're leveraging from AWS here. We see a lot of C-related terminology here, or at least some video review and media boxes. But just to give you guys an idea of what happens when a file comes into C, so you can kind of get a picture of some of the underlying AWS services that we're taking advantage of. Anybody care to hear that? Hands? There we go. All right, well, you're kind of an insider, but okay, there's a few. You never know what the balance is between people looking to kind of learn a little bit about how the cloud can help their business versus how we can leverage certain technology. So I'm just gonna take a quick second, literally maybe 1 minute, to tell you what happens when a file comes into C, and then also when somebody maybe wants to send a media box so that you can get a feel for what's being leveraged. So we leverage Aspera for a lot of file transfer, high-speed file transfers into and out of the platform. We also have our own accelerated transfer, which is taking advantage of some really cool things you can do with Amazon's S3. So given the fact that you can have basically unlimited write access, you're able to split transfers up into multiple pieces. So rather than just send a piece of a file on one thread, I can break that up into literally hundreds of different transfers of pieces of that content and take advantage of that throughput that AWS provides. So that's a big deal from a file transfer standpoint. When content lands, we're taking advantage of a lot of the SQS capabilities from queuing mechanisms to drive a lot of workflow that we have. So we're obviously leveraging EC2. We're a huge customer. Since we're a multi-tenant SaaS platform, we have lots and lots of EC2 instances running of all different shapes and sizes. So we take advantage of something called a reserve purchase, where you can basically say, I know that I'm going to use this much of EC2 this year in these different flavors and sizes, so I'm going to pre-buy it. That gives us some cost advantages there that you can take advantage. But we also have a real spiky throughput, right? People will come and at a customer last year that uploaded 40,000 hours of video content, and they decided to do that in, start on a weekend. Over a week, they had a lot of bandwidth. Over a week, it was done. And when I say done, it was ingested into S3. It was transcoded into 3 different proxies, leveraging some of our own internal transcoding technology, as well as some other third-party services. Various checksum processes were done to check the file integrity of that content. image thumbnails are automatically created, again, leveraging all of this infrastructure in AWS at scale and taking advantage of, in these situations where there's a lot that comes in at once, of the spot instance market. So for those of you unfamiliar, what that means is that you can more or less bid on available EC2 instances. And as a result, you can get a pretty good deal on those, much less than you would in the standard kind of on-demand marketplace. So that is something that's hugely beneficial and a good example of how AWS is truly caring about what their customers are trying to achieve. They have these instances sitting there. Just so happens that at this moment they're not being used, so they're going to make it available at a lower cost to people. And there's some slight drawback to that in the sense that you're not guaranteed that particular instance. It can be pulled out from under you by somebody who's willing to pay the on-demand price. But if you're architected in such a way from a system standpoint that you can recover from that, which hopefully we are, then that's okay, because you've saved so much money leveraging that spot market that if it takes you an extra 30 seconds or even 5 minutes to finish a transcode job, it's well worth it. After the transcodes, after the virus checking, all of these other things are happening. The content then can be moved to different tiers of storage. So you can leave it on S3 so that it's perfectly available to anybody. The second they click download, they start getting bits back. Or you can push that content down to Glacier, and now you've got that stored at a very high level of redundancy. But it's not necessarily quite as accessible, meaning you have to restore it before you download it. But you as a user have that flexibility, and what we've done is exposed that capability that AWS provides to the end user in a real simple way. And then lastly, let's see, when you send content to somebody, we mentioned not wanting to necessarily send the media to various locations so it lands on their servers and now we've got security risk. We're actually pushing that content out to CloudFront, which is basically a content delivery network that's globally accessible. UMG has people everywhere, all over the world, and so when they click play, they want to actually watch that content to provide some feedback, it plays instantly. So just wanted to quickly give you a couple of a pencil sketch of some of the AWS services that we're taking advantage of, which are making a lot of this functionality available.
Yeah. And I will add that when we talk about maybe moving some of the content to Glacier, one of the other nice features is that in the UI, while it might mean that there's a couple of hour restore time if you wanted to download that file, one of the things that is actually very nice about the C platform is that that content is actually still available to our users. So archive doesn't mean I've put it behind a wall and I can no longer see it and I can't interact with it. You can actually see it, you can play it in C, you can add metadata, you can continue to enhance it and augment it, and so you can interact with it even though it's in Glacier. The only thing you would need to wait for is if you actually needed to download it. So from a user's perspective, it's still very available. Yeah? So the question.
Yeah. Go ahead. The question was, can a customer use their own S3 bucket? And that's the answer of not yet. But we've heard that so much over the last 18 months that it's currently on our roadmap. We hope to have it done this calendar year. We do have the ability to import from your own S3 bucket. We also have the ability to export to your own S3 bucket. But actually having a managed S3 bucket accessible to C is something we'll see later this calendar year. Okay. Yes, the question is, and I'll paraphrase, are we leveraging any existing AI or ML-based services in AWS? If we are, how are we integrating that with any legacy media asset management systems? Okay. So I'll speak, it's a two-prong answer. I'll let UMG speak to what they may be doing with us and with others. And then I'll just tell you generally what the C Media Cloud platform is doing. Right now, we're in the process of integrating AWS Transcribe. because we have a need from lots of customers to, as that content is coming in, transcribe it to do two things. One is mainly allow users to quickly find pieces of content in a post-production environment so they can begin the editorial process or be much more efficient. That transcribed content will be time aligned to the proxies so that you can obviously go directly to that location in the video. It will also become searchable. We leverage Elasticsearch for a search engine, so all the custom generated metadata as well as technical metadata that we generate can be put into Elasticsearch and be made accessible to all. Recognition, so we have not done anything with recognition yet, but there is a slide at the very end that says one of the proof of concepts that we're currently engaging on with UMG, which we'll touch on, I think, at the end.
Next slide.
Next slide, there we go.
Perfect time.
Oh, sorry, last bit. So I guess that's always kind of a tough question to answer because people have a different idea of what integration means. And they look at it from, can you integrate with me versus can I integrate with you? Our answer to that is everything that you can do with content within our user interface is accessible through a REST API. So a lot of our customers will use C as a transient mechanism to get content in as a central acquisition point, have the content process, so whether or not that's transcode or AutoQC or thumbnail creation or and all of those, they'll take that information and then pull content down into their on-premise system. They don't do that in too many cases because there is that egress aspect of having the content go in there, but we do have customers that have seen the advantage of being able to process content at scale, and most importantly, have this ring around their facility where content can securely go in and out and then integrate with their existing system. We do not have any built-in integrations with any existing digital asset management systems or any vendors that are out there. We do have a couple with some storage management vendors. So SGL, for instance, can interact with C like it can interact with any other storage location. All right, the floor is yours.
Well, that was a perfect segue actually into our next use case, which is, it's a slightly different use case. This is actually, as you can imagine, UMG has an enormous catalog of hundreds of thousands, may well be millions of images, so archival photo assets that we needed to centralize and give visibility to, and in this case, we needed to give visibility to several different groups, again, who are decentralized and find themselves in different offices around the world. So here our stakeholders were very much our archive team and our catalog teams who, on the one hand, they're responsible for the preservation and asset management of those assets. And on the other hand, we have a team who's responsible for the remonetization of those assets. So whether that's a discrete monetization of an image asset itself, or whether it's the 30th anniversary of Project X, or it's the 50th anniversary of a particular group or artist, at those times, obviously, we're going back into our archives and we're finding appropriate assets. So in this case, what we actually did is we ingested north of 1 million assets, and we increased the visibility of those assets, particularly this population of some 500,000 assets, and we were able to augment the metadata about some of them using the metadata templates available in C. This is actually one of the projects that we're in the process of discussing whether or not this might make sense as a candidate for maybe leveraging recognition or something similar to say, okay, so we have this very rich inventory of these images. There are some where it may be the case that maybe the artist isn't identified. Metadata is metadata through the years, right? It's been completed to varying degrees by varying people and varying systems through the years. So it might be the case of either identifying individuals or identifying other aspects about that image that might be valuable. So distinguishing the images in which Frank Sinatra is smoking and not smoking or something of that nature.
Are there anywhere he's not smoking?
Maybe a few. Not to your point, maybe not that many. Being able to recognize the iconic Capitol Records building in a photograph, right? Those are things that are certainly of interest to us. And if we think about how we catalog our assets and the amount of metadata that we would like to capture about those assets in 2018 and beyond, that's obviously far more sophisticated than it was maybe in some past years. So this might be a population of assets that we're considering. So we're having some of those discussions. That said, since those assets are now available to our users in C, that user-defined structured metadata model has been very helpful. In this case, these assets actually inherited metadata from multiple legacy systems. And so we were able to bring that metadata in. In some cases, we were able to parse it. In other cases, we kept it as is, but we didn't want to lose any of that context. And because all of it is fully searchable in C by the users can still retrieve those assets as needed. And because that metadata model is user-defined, it is very flexible. So we simply partner with the Sony team to specify a metadata model for each group, and we're able to avail ourselves of the existing metadata and create new metadata. In addition, this workflow is a little bit unusual in that the way that one interacts with a series of images is by definition different than the way that you would interact with a series of audio files, right? Where you're going to want to see just the thumbnails, you're going to want to print contact sheets, and you're going to want to do things that are, again, a little bit unique to images. So when you're looking at a series of images, you might not actually need a whole lot of metadata because the image, when a person is looking at it, it speaks for itself, right? So you actually maybe want to display those assets literally in the UI a little bit differently than if you're looking at just a bunch of audio files with, they certainly don't have thumbnails. I guess we could put them, but there the metadata is much more important. So when we onboarded this workflow in particular, we actually reached out to the Sony team and said, a photo group has a series of very specific requests and requirements. Would there be a way to incorporate some of those requests and requirements into the platform? And so the Sony team had said, yes, A, that's in keeping with what is in line for C, and B, we might not have been the only ones to articulate some of those, and so those were actually incorporated, and you might have some more context from Sony's side on some of those things.
No, I mean, you weren't the only one, but you are our favorite one, so that's why we kind of went that direction to do it. But it makes a lot of sense because I think it's a good example of when you have a system that you roll out to lots of different groups, they have different needs, right? And so, whereas to your point, our initial focus was around audio and video assets. Photos were sort of outside, or I shouldn't say they were outside, but they certainly weren't inside the initial scope. But it makes sense if we're talking about a central repository of content for a global enterprise, it certainly makes a lot of sense to be able to support all kinds of these assets. And so that user experience is key, and being able to interact with photos in bulk in that manner made a ton of sense.
Yeah, it definitely did. And I think one of the other things that was very beneficial for us is at UMG, we do have a system that is an artist mastering system. So it holds the canonical values, and it deduplicates and disambiguates our artists, and it tracks our valid and invalid aliases. So it's the classic Sean Combs, P. Diddy, Puff Daddy example. So valid aliases versus the Amy Winehouse, Amy Wirehouse clearly being an invalid alias, right? So we do actually have a system at UMG that centralizes that. And so one of the things that is important to us is that whenever possible,
we're getting the big times up here.
In Supreme Court lights, that we be able
30
to
more minutes, folks, we're almost done.
They're only waiting for their cocktails. That we be able to integrate with that and leverage those values, so we're doing that through an API. All right, so I will accelerate and speak much more quickly. This, we probably have touched on many of these considerations. Suffice it to say that because it is a large organization with content in varying locations around the world, we do have a need to upload a lot of that legacy content into the system in a timely manner. So there are those local hard drives in various places, and we certainly have been working with some of our colleagues around the world to get that content into the system. And we've been doing that by leveraging some of those file acceleration technologies that David mentioned earlier, and file requests, which are actually really interesting. I don't think we mentioned them yet, but it's actually the way that a non-user of the system can contribute content to the system in a secure manner, but then not have access to that content, so not be able to view, edit, delete, modify in any way that piece of content or any other, and it's been great. So if you think about the case where you work with either a production company or an editor on an ongoing basis, and that person should always be able to send you content, but shouldn't necessarily have visibility to the full asset repository, there's a very easy way to send that request and for them to continue to upload that in a secure manner. And moreover, we can specify the place where that content lands. So we can direct that content to the correct folder so that the workflow can be notified of it, pick up that content, and continue moving it forward through in a timely manner. Again, we've talked about some of the S3 and Glacier benefits and how we're using them, and the fact that we now are able to capture the metadata not only at a file level, but we're also actually able to capture it now at higher levels, so folder and in C-Speak workspaces. So what for us would be projects. So if you're describing an artist's performance at Coachella, as you can imagine, there's a fair amount of that metadata that you actually only need to capture once because it's unique to that event, and you don't necessarily want somebody to have to recapture that for every single one of the hundreds, if not thousands, of files that are going to be generated from that single event. So now we can actually capture that higher level metadata once and still then find all associated content in the system when we do a search on those terms. So just a few fun facts for folks, and then what maybe some of the future holds for us. So we actually deployed C not that long ago. It's actually very new within the UMG ecosystem, so it's been a little over a year. And in that time, we've ingested north of 3.5 million assets. Those media boxes that we mentioned earlier that are the ways of sharing content, there have been more than 10,000 media boxes open. And again, twice we've used snowballs to do those mass ingests of large volumes of content. And then as we look forward, some of the conversations that we're having with the Sony team and internally amongst the UMG stakeholders to determine what might make sense for us would be the POC that we mentioned earlier, maybe for those photos with recognition, and then looking to see how we can further integrate this technology with other pieces of the existing ecosystem. So how we could maybe connect it with the supply chain, how we could be receiving in those assets and integrate it with project commissioning. So if you can imagine, when you greenlight a project, if you say, okay, in my project commissioning system, I'm going to create my project, that project would maybe create a space in C that says, okay, this is where all associated project files will be stored. You could start to issue those file requests that would go out so that content contributors would have those immediately available. As that content starts to come in, we get alerts. You could then take it through the rest of its ecosystem to have that online collaboration, an editorial, and maybe potentially all the way through to distribution. So those conversations are in varying degrees of sort of advancement, but those are some of the things that we're looking at, and it's nice that we understand that the technology is at least flexible enough to integrate as might be deemed appropriate. So that was we sped up at the end. But with that, should we turn it over to any additional questions that folks might have?
Where are the cocktails? That's the question.
Hello. So the beginning of your journey to AWS, can you give us some insight as to criteria why you guys chose AWS, whether it was economic factors, whether it was new capabilities? Kind of go through that.
Sure, you want to take it from, I guess there's two perspectives. There's the Sony perspective of why did we choose to build C on top of AWS. That's certainly one, but there's also more from a customer journey perspective. From a UMG, what were some of the considerations?
I think we certainly touched on many of them from a business perspective, and the fact that it was facilitated and worked seamlessly with the C platform was a key consideration for us.
From the Sony perspective, we started developing Sony C in 2012. And at that time, we were doing a shootout with all of the public cloud vendors. And Amazon at the time was a clear winner in our mind. And we're glad we made that decision for a whole bunch of reasons, least of which is, I don't know if you guys saw one of the presentations earlier, I think it was some of the opening remarks from Usman Shakil, who was one of the original solution architects that helped us. I think there was something like 1,700 new product releases in AWS in the last year. That amount of innovation is kind of unparalleled. So we got a sense of that back in 2012, and I think we've been luckily we made the right bet because we've just seen that accelerate. From a cost standpoint, at the time it was less of a cost consideration between the various public clouds, but it was certainly the question of we are moving to the cloud because Sony wants to have workflows that connect their cameras all the way through to processing and then again through to facilitate whatever distribution needs there could be. So we knew that's what we wanted to do. So maybe if the question is aligned towards why didn't you build this maybe on premise or in multiple data centers of your own, it clearly didn't line up with a lot of what our primary objectives were, which was how do we facilitate having content in a central location and then let processing be brought to it. And whether or not that processing is purely within AWS or purely within our system, that shouldn't matter. We don't want to lock content up into a small set of data centers that we're managing ourselves. That was a lot of our consideration at the time. I don't know if that helps. All right, is that it? All right, woohoo! Thank you guys.